August 30th, 1813, noon. A frontier stockade in the Mississippi Territory, baking under an Alabama sun. Inside its walls, more than 500 people, soldiers, planters, refugees, women, children, and the enslaved. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, hundreds of them would be dead. You have probably seen this day described the same way every time. A 22-minute massacre that wiped out an entire British garrison. 2 claims, repeated everywhere, both completely false. There was no British garrison, and it did not take 22 minutes. What actually happened at Fort Mims lasted roughly 5 hours, and it began not with a British flag, but with a wooden gate that would not close because sand had buried it, and because the man in command could not be bothered to dig it out. This was not a war between empires. It was something stranger and far more intimate. A civil war inside a single nation fought with borrowed gunpowder, decided by one officer's arrogance. We remember massacres by their dead. We forget that almost all of them were warned. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a fort packed with 500 people was left with its main gate jammed permanently open. Why a man who told the truth was tied to a post and whipped for it. Why 1,000 warriors charged that gate, convinced they could not be killed. Where the 22 minutes actually comes from, and it isn't history. And why the man who planned the whole attack turned his horse around and rode away before it ended. This is the battle that made Andrew Jackson and broke the Creek Nation. Hit subscribe, and let's walk into Fort Mims. To understand why those gates stood open, you first have to understand who was really fighting, because the title gets it exactly backwards. By 1813, the Muskogee, the Creek, were tearing themselves apart. For 2 decades, the United States had pressed a plan of civilization on them. Abandon the hunt, fence the land, take up the plow and the spinning wheel, and, in many cases, African slavery. Among the lower Creeks and the wealthy mixed heritage families of the Tensaw district, many embraced it. They built plantations, they grew rich. A national council, encouraged by the U.S. Indian agent Benjamin Hawkins, handed power to the leaders who cooperated. The upper Creeks, deeper inland along the Coosa and Tallapoosa, watched their nation being fenced, bought, and converted out of existence, and they refused. In the fall of 1811, the Shawnee leader Tecumseh rode south and gave that refusal a voice, demanding a return to the old ways and a united stand against American expansion. The council, led by the assimilationist chief Big Warrior, rejected him, but among the younger Upper Creek warriors, his message caught fire. And that winter, when the Great Comet burned overhead and the New Madrid earthquakes split the ground, prophets read it as proof the spirits agreed. They became the Red Sticks, named for the Crimson War clubs that, in Muskogee tradition, declared open war. And they turned that war first on their own people, burning plantations, smashing spinning wheels, executing Creeks who had sided with the Americans. Here is the fact the famous title inverts completely. The Red Sticks were the ones courting foreign powers. In the summer of 1813, their chiefs rode to Spanish Pensacola for gunpowder and lead, and the Spanish, loosely aligned with Britain, handed it over, happy to use the insurgents to bleed the American frontier. The defenders of Fort Mims were the Americans and their Creek allies. The British and Spanish armed the attackers, not the defended. That powder run is what lit the fuse. American militia under Colonel James Caller and Captain Dixon Bailey ambushed the returning convoy at Burnt Corn Creek in July. They won the opening clash, then broke ranks to loot the pack train, and the warriors they'd scattered came roaring back and routed them. Burnt Corn changed everything. It dragged the United States directly into a Creek Civil War, and it gave the Red Sticks a single name to hate. Dixon Bailey, the mixed-blood captain who had turned his guns on his own. They swore to find him. They knew exactly where he would be. When the frontier panicked, settlers threw up stockades wherever they could, 15 of them, before the militia consolidated the refugees into 5. The largest grew around the plantation of Fort Mims, a ferry crossing at the western end of the Federal Road, the great migration route between Georgia, Mobile, and New Orleans. Mims ringed his frame house and roughly 15 outbuildings with a split-rail palisade about 70 yards square, call it an ACRE. Into that single acre crowded somewhere between 517 and 553 people, around 175 Mississippi Territorial Volunteers, 70 Tensaw Home Militia, a small detachment of regulars, scores of planters and refugees, and roughly 100 enslaved African Americans. It was so overcrowded that disease and shortage were already setting in. Not a garrison, a refugee camp with soldiers inside it. Command went to Major Daniel Beasley, a lawyer, a former territorial legislator, a sheriff with political ambitions, and, by every account, no military experience whatsoever, a heavy hand for drink, and open contempt for the idea that Indians would ever dare attack him. Everything that could be done wrong, Beasley did. General Claiborne ordered the blockhouses finished. Beasley left them unfinished. He posted no real sentries in the surrounding cane, and the eastern double gates, the fort's main entrance, stood open so long that the summer rains washed sand and clay into a hard ramp against their base, fixing them in place. Survivors later claimed the officers were drunk and playing cards while it happened. Whatever the truth of that, Beasley never cleared it. On the night of August 29th, William Weatherford, known as Red Eagle, crept to the wall himself with 2 warriors and saw all of it. The open gate, the empty cane, and one more gift. The firing loopholes had been cut too low in the palisade. A man standing outside the wall could fire straight through them into the crowd within. Then the warnings came, and Beasley buried every one. That same day, Claiborne had sent explicit written word that an attack was imminent. Beasley wrote back, boasting he could hold the place against any number of Indians. The next morning, 2 enslaved men tending cattle outside the walls spotted painted warriors massing in the brush and sprinted back to raise the alarm. Beasley sent out a patrol. It found nothing because the Red Sticks were far better at hiding than his men were at looking. So he had one of those men tied to the whipping post and flogged for lying. Shortly before noon, a mixed-blood scout named James Cornells galloped in shouting that the Creeks were coming. Beasley, by several accounts drunk, laughed in his face and said Cornells had mistaken a herd of red cattle for a war party. The red cows were nearly 1,000 warriors. They were already in a ravine 400 yards out, waiting for the one signal Beasley himself was about to give them. At noon, the garrison drum beat for the midday meal. Weapons were stacked. Men were eating, dancing, playing cards. To the Red Sticks waiting in the ravine, that drum was the signal. Phase 1. The breach. The warriors rose and ran for the open gate, strategy set by Weatherford, fury supplied by the prophet Paddy Walsh, who had performed the rituals that promised them American lead could not touch their bodies. Beasley finally understood what he had done. He ran for the gate to force it shut and found the sand he'd ignored for weeks had set like cement. He died there, clubbed and tomahawked in the gateway he'd doomed, his Mississippi men cut down around him. The warriors poured through unhindered, killed the man still tied to the whipping post, and seized the entire outer enclosure. Then, exactly as Weatherford had planned, they crouched at those low loopholes and fired their muskets straight into the packed, defenseless yard. And this is the only kernel of truth buried inside the 22-minute myth. The command structure and the outer wall really did collapse in a matter of minutes. The frontline defense evaporated almost instantly, but that was the beginning of the battle, not the whole of it. And the number itself has no root in 1813 at all. No survivor account, no officer's report, no contemporary record clocks this battle at 22 minutes. The figure is a modern invention, stapled onto the siege long after the fact by people who never read the people who were there. The real fighting had only just begun. Phase 2, the inner defense. With Beasley dead, command fell to the one man the Red Sticks had come specifically to kill, Dixon Bailey. Shouting orders in both English and Muskogee, he hauled the survivors back into the Mims house and the inner buildings. His brothers climbed onto the roof, tore off the shingles to make elevated firing ports, and rained accurate rifle fire down into the courtyard. The charge stalled. Out in the open ground, Red Sticks began to die in numbers their prophets had sworn were impossible, and when one of their most feared holy men, the prophet far-off warrior, was shot dead in plain view of warriors who believed themselves bulletproof, the spell cracked. Walsh's answer was to order his men to throw down their firearms and come on with club and knife. Phase 3, the lull. By around 3 o'clock, the assault had blunted into an exhausted, blood-soaked stalemate, and the Red Sticks pulled back to the woods to argue. Here, Weatherford, the man who had scouted the wall and planned the breach, had seen enough. He had wanted to humble an arrogant garrison, not slaughter children, and he argued hard to take the plunder, claim the victory, and leave. The prophets overruled him, Walsh loudest of all. Enraged by the resistance and hungry to finish Bailey and every mixed-blood Creek inside the walls. Realizing he had lost all control of what he had started, Weatherford mounted his black horse and rode away from the field before the end. Phase 4, the fire. The warriors came back with a new weapon. They wrapped arrows in dry Spanish moss and tow, set them alight, and arced them onto the parched wooden roofs of the house, the kitchen, the outbuildings. The fort became an oven. Now the people trapped inside had only one choice left: burn where they stood or break into the open and be cut down. They broke. They were cut down. By 5 o'clock, the guns fell silent. The fort was ash and bodies, and the warriors took roughly 250 scalps. The casualty figures are still debated, and the honest answer is that fire and scavengers put an exact reckoning beyond anyone's reach. When a burial detail finally returned to the ruins months later, they interred 247 dead, and most counts placed the defenders and civilians killed somewhere between 250 and 400, very nearly everyone inside. Around 100 Red Sticks fell as well, a costly afternoon for the attackers. About 100 enslaved people were not killed but taken, spared as plunder, because the Upper Creeks, for all their rejection of American culture, had absorbed American slavery into their own economy, and between roughly 36 and 50 people, somehow, got out alive. Dixon Bailey, the man they had come for, was shot during the final collapse. He chopped a hole through the northern palisade and escaped into the swamp, carrying his young child. He never reached safety. A burial party found his body weeks later, identified by the engraved rifles still beside him. One escape changed the tempo of everything that followed. An enslaved woman named Hester, herself shot and bleeding, slipped through the warriors' lines found a stray canoe on the bank of the Alabama River and paddled miles downstream in agony to Fort Stoddart, the first human being to carry the news of the massacre to General Claiborne and the American command. And one story cut entirely the other way. A planter named Zachariah McGirth had left the fort that very morning to gather provisions. He rode back toward the sound of gunfire, hid in a bayou, watched the smoke climb, and came into the ruins the next day, certain his whole family had burned. What he did not know was that a Red Stick warrior named Sonota had saved them. Years before, McGirth's mixed-blood Creek wife, Vicey, had taken Sonota in as a starving orphan and raised him beside her own children. At the height of the slaughter, he recognized her, stepped in front of Vicey and her daughters, and claimed them as his personal slaves to shield them from the other warriors. He hid them in a Creek village for months. After Sonota fell in a later battle, the family walked out of the wilderness and were reunited with McGirth in Mobile. One mercy in a day that held almost none. A century and a half later, the ground confirmed all of it. In 1973, archaeologists from the University of South Alabama excavated the overgrown site and found the dark soil stains of the 70-yard stockade exactly where the records placed it. The charred fragments of fine British-made tableware the wealthy refugees had carried in, melted lead balls fired by the defenders, brass arrow points made by the Red Sticks, and at the bottom of an old well, a heavy iron broadaxe stamped with 2 pecked initials, ZM, Zachariah McGirth's. The earth had kept the receipts. The smoke rising off that burning acre did exactly what the prophets should have feared most. Remember, Fort Mims became a rallying cry across the entire South. A republic already humiliated in the early War of 1812 wanted vengeance, and the scale of the disaster handed its governments all the political cover they needed to mobilize without hesitation. In Tennessee, the legislature put 3,500 volunteers under a hard, relentless, anti-British major general named Andrew Jackson. Jackson marched south and burned his way through Red Stick country, backed by Cherokee, Choctaw, and White Stick Creek allies who wanted the prophets crushed just as badly. The Red Sticks, outnumbered, undersupplied, fighting on every front at once, could not hold. On March 27, 1814, at Horseshoe Bend on the Tallapoosa River, Jackson surrounded the last great Red Stick stronghold and killed more than 800 warriors in a single afternoon. The movement was finished. Then Weatherford, Red Eagle, the man who had planned Fort Mims and ridden away from its worst hour, rode alone into Jackson's camp to surrender. He asked nothing for himself, only that Jackson feed the starving Creek women and children hiding in the woods. Jackson, of all people, let him live, reasoning that a living chief would bring the others in. He showed the nation no such mercy. In August 1814, he forced the Creek leadership, including the loyal White Sticks who had fought for him, to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, surrendering 23 million acres. More than half the entire Creek homeland, most of modern Alabama and a piece of Georgia, gone in a single signature. That is the cruel arithmetic of Fort Mims. The Red Sticks won the battle and destroyed the very thing they had taken up the war club to defend. Their victory became the moral pretext that let the United States take everything and laid the road that ended, years later, at the Trail of Tears. So remember what actually happened here. Not a British garrison, not 22 minutes. A 5-hour fire in a crowded acre, fed by old grievances and one man's certainty that the warnings were beneath him. The gate could have been closed in an afternoon. No one bothered. And by the time anyone understood what that would cost, the sand had already set.